Welcome to session 4 of our study from Walk Thru the Bible, More Than a Book, 5 Big Bible Questions. You know, despite the Bible's preeminence in our culture and the influence that it has around the world, the Bible is perhaps one of the most debated books in all of human history. And the question that we're asking in session 4 of our study together gets really to the heart of that debate. And that is the Bible reliable? The trustworthiness and the authenticity of the Bible is challenged in lots of different ways and on different fronts. Here's some that you may have heard or even some that you're wrestling with yourself. You hear things like, well, the Bible is full of a bunch of contradictions or a bunch of errors. You know, all we have is copies of the original text of the Bible, and it's nothing but a bunch of errors and mistakes that we can find. Or you hear things like, well, you know, the only place that Jesus is ever mentioned is in the Bible, and the Bible clearly had an agenda, and it really can't be trusted, or those eyewitnesses wouldn't be dependable. Or thanks to popular books like the Da Vinci Code, you know, you hear these ideas that, you know, Constantine created a bunch of ideas that weren't in the Bible. There's a whole bunch of missing books that needed to be added in, or the Bible was changed in the medieval period for some sort of political ideology or political purposes. You know, if you're wrestling with some of those questions yourself, or maybe you're wondering, well, how would I respond if someone asked me those questions? Well, this session is for you. You know, there's so much more that we could talk about related to these topics about the reliability of the Bible than we have time for in our few minutes together. But what I hope we can do is to provide some foundational, basic, introductory principles to help us think through how do we answer the question, is the Bible reliable? Well, there's 3 big words that I want to give you as we'll talk through them each together. The first is the word authenticity. Is our modern Bible, the Bible that we have today, an authentic copy of the Bible written when and how the Bible claims to be? A few years ago, I had to get involved with one of my son's classes. It was an unfortunate situation where there was an assignment that he had to do, and it was all done online. And so there was a computer software that they were using, and he had to do the assignment online and submit the assignment online, no printed copies anywhere. And it was one of those situations where my son was saying, you know, I did the assignment and I turned it in, and the teacher was saying, well, I log into the computer system and I don't see the assignment, and so you're going to get a 0 for the work. And it was going to have a pretty big impact on his grade. And so, you know, I had to get involved as a parent in that situation. And fortunately, as we started looking at all of his work, we could log into the system that he was using, and we could find some digital fingerprints of his work. We could see when he logged into the system. We could see when the assignment was modified and edited. And all of that was really enough proof to say, yeah, he had done this work, and we don't know what happened to it, but there's enough evidence to say that it had been done. You know, we love that kind of evidence, don't we? That sort of digital fingerprint. We tell our kids to be careful about what they put online because things that you put online, they just simply don't go away these days. If that's our framework, it can be difficult to think about ancient texts, especially texts that are thousands of years old. I mean, think about how different the ancient world was related to writing. The ancient world was primarily an oral culture. Things were told, stories were told more than they were written. The availability of materials to write in, the knowledge to write in was the exception and not the norm. I mean, think for us, we write everything down. It's nothing for us to get a piece of paper and scribble something down, even to be thrown away later. That's not the way in which the ancient world worked. If we try to apply our 21st century experience as a rule for the authenticity of first century documents, it's going to lead to frustration And it may even lead to some bad conclusions. But having said that, let me be clear. There is overwhelming evidence to claim the authenticity of our Bibles. Well, how do we do that? Well, let's think about what we have. What do we have relative to the Bible? So the original versions of the books of the Bible have been lost. What we have are copies. So in the ancient world, copies of the biblical books were done by scribes or by others who were copying and then recopying the Old Testament and then the New Testament. A letter might have been written, and then someone would copy the letter before it was passed on to preserve a copy. And those copies were copied, and that's what we have. We don't have the original text, but we have copies of the original text. And that's true not just of the Bible. That's true of ancient writings in general. We don't have preserved copies of ancient texts. We have copies of those ancient texts. And as we want to evaluate the authenticity of the copies that we have, there's two really important factors that we need to think about. The first is, how old are the copies? So you could assume that the older a copy is, or the closer a copy is to the writing of the original document, the more authentic it would be. So if the oldest copies we have are farther away from the original, then that gives more chance for there to be changes and modifications and differences that were created. The second factor is the number of copies. If there was an ancient document that was written and we just have, one or two or a handful of copies, then we may not be sure how authentic those are. But if we have lots of copies, then there's more evidence to suggest that the copies that we have are authentic. So what about the Bible? What can we say about the Bible as it relates to the authenticity of the ancient copies that we have? And let's talk specifically here about the New Testament. But before we get to the Bible, let me share a little bit about some other ancient writings that we have. So I'll give you a few examples. So this is a copy of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. It was written somewhere between 58 and 52 BC. The oldest copies that we have of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars are around 900 to 1,000 years after it was written. So this version that I just ordered online, the oldest copies that we have to create this version of the text are about 900 to 1,000 years after. And we only have about 10 ancient copies of Caesar's Gallic War. So I want to illustrate this. So I've got 10 pieces of paper here. And so I want you to think, so this is 900 to 1,000 years after the original, and we've got maybe 10 different copies of ancient manuscripts. So 10 copies, 900 to 1,000 years later. Here's another first century writing from Tacitus. Tacitus was a historian in the ancient world. He lived from maybe 56 to 117 AD, wrote several histories. The oldest copies that we have are 900 to 1,000 years after the original. We have a few more ancient manuscripts, maybe about 20 copies or so. So here's 20 pieces of paper. They represent the 20 ancient manuscripts that we have of Tacitus's writings. Again, 900 to 1,000 years after it was written. Here's another example. Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a lawyer. He was a magistrate in ancient Rome, wrote in the early 2nd century. We have some manuscripts that are a little bit closer to date than these samples. We've got manuscripts that are about 750 years from the original, and about 10 ancient copies that we have of Pliny the Younger. Homer the Iliad is actually a pretty interesting ancient text. It was written 900 BC, so much earlier than these. These were written around the time of the New Testament and the early church. Homer's Iliad was written 900 BC. The oldest copies that we have were about 500 years after the original writing. So we have older manuscript evidence for the Iliad, and we actually have a lot more. We have about 650 ancient manuscripts. So you see the difference, right? So there's a ream of paper and another 150 sheets representing the 650 ancient manuscripts that we have, and 500 years after the original. So here's some examples, and generally speaking, all of these are viewed as authentic. The copies that you can go to a bookstore or go online and buy would be viewed as authentic, and this represents the number of manuscripts that we have. And again, 900 to 1,000 years, 900 to 1,000 years, 750, 500 years after the original writing and the oldest manuscripts that we have. So now let's talk about the New Testament. The oldest known copies that we have of the New Testament were written within 100 years of the writing of the New Testament. Not 900 or 1,000 or even 500 years, but within 100 years. And if you start adding up the number of ancient Greek manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, it's a lot. 500, it's 1,000, it's 1,500, it's 2,000, more than 2,000, 2,500, there's 3,000. You get the point? It's not even this tall. We have nearly 6,000 ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Do you see the difference? Not 10, not 20, not even 500. It'd be knock our table over if we kept stacking them up. 6,000 ancient Greek manuscripts. The authenticity of the New Testament is unquestionable compared to the same level of evidence that we apply to any other ancient text. But here's what's even more fascinating is that if you were to go and you were to look at all 6,000 of those ancient Greek manuscripts and you were to combine them together and you say, well, if there's 6,000 ancient manuscripts, how consistent are they? Are they a bunch of errors? Were there a bunch of copying mistakes? How consistent are they? If you add them all up and you look at the variance between them, they are 99 to 99.5% consistent. That's astonishing. That means that within 1%, all of the Greek manuscripts that we have, old copies of the original New Testament, are 99% accurate. And that 1%, you might go, well, that means there's errors in the Bible. And then that's not what we're saying. We're saying that 1% would represent mistakes when the manuscripts were copied over and over. So you see clear copying mistakes, a word that might have been omitted, or letters that might have been inverted, or a copyist was going down a line and accidentally jumped down to the next line. All of those are just represent about 1% of the text of the New Testament, and none of those represent any major doctrinal issues. Here's the point. The authenticity of the New Testament is the Bible that we hold in our hands today. Is it an authentic copy of what God originally spoke and breathed out to the writers of the New Testament? Unquestionably, it is. If someone says, well, we can't believe the Bible because we don't have the original version, you just have to throw out so much of the ancient written world, because the evidence for the authenticity of the Bible is just overwhelming. I said I was going to give you 3 words. The first word is authenticity. The second word is dependability. Can we trust the words and the message that the Bible's authors wrote? See, you could say, well, the Bible's authentic. It's an actual copy. But the authors, they were lunatics. They were crazy people, and we can't really trust their words. They're not dependable in what they were writing. You know, often you hear some common objections around the dependability of the Bible, especially the New Testament, to say things like, well, it's a bunch of contradictions, or the New Testament writers, they were biased. They had an agenda. They had a purpose in what they were writing, and they weren't being dependable witnesses of what they had seen. You know, I think there's a couple of things that we can say. First, I would say that there's just simply no reason to distrust the authors of the New Testament. The New Testament writers, they wrote, they were either eyewitnesses or wrote very soon after the events that they were describing took place. But you also have to think about who these New Testament writers were. You know, we often hear that the New Testament writers were biased, and they were just trying to support a cause that they believed in. Think about the New Testament writers. They had everything to lose as they recorded the things that they had witnessed. When they wrote the New Testament and those documents were circulated out and they were claiming that they had seen a resurrected Jesus, it led to their persecution. It led to loss of home and family. It led to, in many cases, it led to their own death. They would not have held fast to something that they believed to be a lie if it was going to lead to the loss of everything, including their own lives. They were incredibly faithful in what they were preserving. They had everything to lose. But they believed in what they saw, and they recorded the truthfulness of what they had witnessed. There's also a remarkable consistency in the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, though it covers a period of time of 1,500 years, you can trace key themes that are present in different books written by different authors, written over thousands of years. There is a remarkable consistency in the Bible. We said the Bible is authentic. We said the Bible is dependable. I'll give you one more word, and that's historical. You know, is the Bible consistent with other historical sources, such as written works or even archaeology? You know, sometimes people say, well, the only place that you ever hear about Jesus is in the Bible, and that's, you know, so you can't really trust that there was this historical Jesus that lived, and that's actually not true. There are ancient sources that were not Jesus followers who reference Jesus or who reference the early church. Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, he wasn't a believer in Jesus as the Messiah or the Savior. He references a historical Jesus that lived. There are at least four non-Christian ancient Roman writers, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. We referenced their works a few minutes ago. Both of them speak about a person named Jesus and the church and the following that they had gathered around them. There is extra biblical evidence, non-New Testament evidence in ancient history, written words that speak to the historical Jesus. And then you look at archaeology. Every year, archaeology continues to support the story of the Bible. And discovery after discovery after discovery simply says that the history that the Bible tells is the history that's found in the archaeological world. And we could say so much more about all of these topics. What I've wanted to do is to just simply give you some foundational understanding of how we answer this question: is the Bible reliable? We've just scratched the surface, but here's what I know to be true: that there is overwhelming evidence to support the reliability of the Bible. I want you to believe that when you hold this book in your hands, and you open it up and you read it, and you try to listen to the words of God, you hear the voice of God speaking in the pages of Scripture, you can have confidence that this is not a copy that was changed and modified. It's not full of a bunch of errors and contradictions. It's not a fairy tale that was made up by people in the first century. Now, this is truth. And all of the evidence that we could find would support its reliability. And I want you to believe and have confidence in the reliability of this book that we hold, that God wrote to us. Well, we've come to the end of session 4. Your turn now. I hope you are taking the time to jump into those discussion questions, study them, reflect on them yourself, talk about them in your small group. And I do want to challenge you to keep faithful in reading the Bible. Maybe you're working through the 40-day Bible reading schedule with us. It's not too late to start. Don't miss an opportunity to let God speak to you in His Word. Thanks for joining us for session 4. We'll see you for one more session in session 5. See you soon. God bless.